social media basically like paved the way for AI.
100%. The unprecedented, voluntary, mass digitization of human behavior called the internet. We couldn't imagine that human beings would voluntarily just give up all the training data.
This is Afsheen Afshar, founder and managing partner of Pilot Wave Holdings, where he's bringing AI to the infrastructure, utilities, and industrial businesses that keep the world running.
We are naive because when oil was discovered in the Middle East and the British, in their infinite wisdom, came in and said, look, we'll give you infrastructure and protection, just give us your oil for free. I think we're in a very similar situation right now. Like Alphabet is giving us a purportedly free service, and we as users of that service are merely just giving up our behavioral data. And we as naive consumers say, look, I think that's worth it. AI doesn't need to be conscious. It's plenty dangerous. Is it fantastically useful? Yes. Could it end humanity on its own without being conscious? Kinda, maybe.
Yeah.
Right?
You said that AI doesn't fail on math, it fails on the org. Where does AI break in adoption? And like, what did you mean by that?
So it's
Thank you so much for coming on another podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So you're probably like the most credentialed guest I've had, but like at least the coolest background. So like you were an MD and a PhD.
I'm not sure that's an honor I want, but I appreciate
Well,
that.
It's an honor you shall have. And I've had some like dope people on here. And so I don't know, like it's really cool. You're at the intersection of both AI and like human medicine. So early in your career when you were getting your MD, you studied a lot of the human brain and what causes the brain to have bipedal movement, right?
Yeah.
I would love to know from that study, now that you've been in finance and now that you've gone into AI and everything, like what's something from the study of the human body that still applies today to your work?
Brief background. So what I did for my PhD was the intersection of what's called neural prosthetics, which if you guys know what Neuralink is, that company, one of my PhD advisors was actually a co-founder of Neuralink. So it's the intersection of that discipline and what would now be called AI machine learning, which my other co-advisor is a guy named Andrew Ng, who wanted to co-found Google Brain and Coursera. So that intersection. So how do people plan, execute movement? And then how do we use multiple noisy signals to decode people planning and executing movement? So that was the PhD was. Now, if you would just take a big step back from that and say, well, what's the math problem there? The math problem there is I have a bunch of signals that are parallel. In the case of my PhD, 100 signals as a function of time. And you want to impute is the actual technical term, what is the brain or the mind of this person trying to plan to do?
Mm-hmm.
That problem, multiple noisy signals, singular output, is applicable to a lot of different domains. It was applicable in the world of finance to say, where's the market as a whole going? It is applicable in the world of business. How do we influence this particular business? How do we manage it?
Yeah.
It's applicable in really any domain where you think there's a system that is operating and we can't observe that system in a noiseless way.
Very cool. So to take it one step deeper, do you think that we're going to eventually have the capability sort of like to completely predict human behavior? Like in theory.
I'm too much of a scientist to say completely predict human. That's too extreme for me. Can we predict human behavior much more accurately? Absolutely. I mean, you've already seen my former colleagues from Stanford, my graduate career, have gone on with Neuralink to really advance what was the state of the art when I was back in graduate school. That, like any advance, will continue. We'll get better. We'll make keyboards that you can control with your mind in a high fidelity way. I often use the metaphor of, this is getting an aged metaphor as time goes on, but if you've seen Star Wars movies and you see Luke had that arm he could control with his thoughts, that will happen. Like, I'm confident to say within our lifetimes, and we're young enough,
cool.
That will happen. Now, can you say, hey, can you predict Afsheen's behavior perfectly? That's a tough one.
So like on one direction, we have Minority Report.
Yeah.
On one direction, we can like play video games and control shit with our minds. Like, what do you think the societal implications are of both those things? Because like on one end, there's a lot of like sovereignty, and as an entrepreneur and a creator, I'm like, holy crap, like if I could just sit here and take everything in my mind and code the app I want, and maybe that's a simplification, whatever, that's super cool. But on the flip end, if there's some like overly compliant society that's like, before you've even made a decision, put you into a bucket, like it's incredibly scary and dangerous.
Oh, that's absolutely terrifying. And I would go even further than this. One of the things that makes me continuously and more nervous as time goes on is that we have an economics that doesn't include people who have been creating the foundational data to power these models. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I've devoted my life to is to try to reverse that trend. Not getting into the details, but suffice it to say that we need an economics that actually rewards individuals who are creating valuable pieces of information otherwise known as our personal data and our small business data and our interaction data, to take part of the harnessing of that. Because as you rightly point out, the incentives for corporations and entities and sovereigns to use that data for their own ends is so outrageously high, it's irresistible.
Can I be spicy and take the other end of this?
Go for it.
Because I think our audience likes a good debate.
Yeah, let's do it.
I would say that like this organization exists in the financial world. It's called FICO, or it's called Vantage or Experian. And like they essentially take your data, take your loan data, and then your reward is you get a better loan rate because of that data, right?
That's the classic response.
And I think there's like tons of, no, I interrupt away.
Yeah.
This is how this podcast rolls. And so like if you go and create that for every other piece of metadata that's out there, like you're essentially creating a ton of regulatory capture and compliance overhead that would be really hard for innovation.
So that statement makes a presumption that I don't think is necessarily true.
Okay.
Which is that there would be an overhang of compliance regulatory capture that's so high that there won't be any innovation. I would say, look, we are in a scenario in which, and this is not my own metaphor, so actually Andrew Ng's metaphor of calling data the new oil, right? I'm going to run with that metaphor. We are in a world right now that is akin to when oil was discovered in the Middle East and the British in their infinite wisdom came in and said, look, we'll give you infrastructure and protection, just give us your oil for free. And that was a barter system that didn't work out necessarily in the favor of the nations who took that barter. I think we're in a very similar situation right now. What people often say is not necessarily FICO, because you're a more sophisticated participant. They usually say Google. Like, look, Alphabet is giving us a purportedly free service, otherwise known as a Google search. And we, as users of that service, are merely just giving off our behavioral data. Now, that trade is obviously in the favor of Alphabet from a cash perspective, right? They're making trillions of dollars from their advertising and all the things that they do. And we, as naive consumers, less naive as days go on, say, look, I think that's worth it. I firmly think that that is not capitalistic because it is not transparent, liquid, and obviously consensual.
I am on the other end where it's like, I think it's hyper capitalistic because you could choose to shield yourself with VPNs. You could choose, like you could go and basically like find all your own products and not use Google, but you choose to use Google to essentially get the best products,
That's like saying I don't have to use the roads
if you're like
outside New York City. It's just not realistic. So I've actually had this debate with many of my former colleagues in my corporate life where they say, Afsheen, you come across as a socialist when I actually think I'm a deep capitalist.
I actually don't think it's socialism, but I think it is a core part of the center Democrat platform around data, like monetization. I do think that like where we probably agree is there's like, I do agree in data sovereignty. Like I do not want all my data sucked up into the big foundational models. And then whatever party has, like Bernie wants 50% of it, like the Trump administration buying it. Like I don't want any federal government tying into my models.
So UBI and taxation and regulation are, again, I'm going to try not to react too strongly to being cast as being a progressive on this. I squarely on the middle. I'm these rare unicorns. I'm not neither on the right nor the left. I think those are at best band-aids, at worst counterproductive. What I'm advocating for is an open, liquid, transparent marketplace. Those are the three things. That's why capitalism, I would argue, is a good idea. It does accurate price finding, but those are the three preconditions: liquid, transparent, consensual. And we have neither of those three right now.
I mean, like Peter Thiel says, a lot of people are against capitalism because they essentially aren't able to play in the system. And I think that's incredibly true. Like if you go look at most people, they have a shitload of student loans. They don't compound. There's no ability to accrue. And then their one asset, you know, I loved red teaming you, but like the one asset is your data, and these companies are making billions and trillions of dollars off your data. Like where is the transparency of that?
Totally.
Right?
So that's what I've devoted, my sort of mental and karmic efforts to. And I think even more broadly, I would say it's to reconnecting effort to reward. Like, I think that when people talk about the American dream, people often talk about specific material acquisitions. I think that actually is short-sighted. And now we're approaching the 250th anniversary of the country. So I think this is pretty relevant. I think the core promise of America is to always have effort and reward coupled, meaning that if I work harder within the system, I get more reward. I think that's become decoupled. And I think both extremes have looked for scapegoats to explain that, because it's human nature to explain our challenges. As a former scientist, I always like to call myself a perpetual scientist. I know, I learned this in medical school, that the way we induce a mouse or rat model of depression, believe it or not, is to give random punishment. It's the randomness that is the key. Because if punishment is random, and if you don't feel like you can control your environment, you get despair, you get anguish. In mostly male populations, you get violence. And that's what we see in our dysfunction right now.
And you see that all around the world.
All around the world.
I've never drawn that conclusion so succinctly. I usually say, I believe the core funding principle is everyone has to pursue the right to pursue happiness.
So that's the declaration.
And anything that you infringe on, like my right to pursue happiness, like I think that's like a good balance. And it's like, if your happiness is like shredding on yours, like that's the big thing. So, to pivot off the data thing, because I think there's not that many people that have literally helped to build human brain interfaces and where this is going. And I'm level 0 on this thing.
Yeah.
Can you talk to the audience a bit about where you think this tech is going, how this tech works?
Sure.
And like the things you're concerned about, the things you're excited about with it. Like that's something I feel like we get a lot of like news bits where it's like, Neuralink slaps some chips in a monkey's brain and whatever, right? And but then on the flip end, there's like a kid playing like Counter-Strike with like a Neuralink in. And I'm like, whoa.
Well, so by the way, those two things aren't that different. So it's actually may not be obvious to the public. Okay, so let me take a step back. Let me start with the caveats because I am a scientist. So this has not been my job for 15 years. I left this field as a profession. So I got my PhD in 2008. I finished my MD PhD in 2010. Just to give folks who are listening just a sense. That said, I am in contact with my former lab mates from time to time. I do read this stuff. I'm going to just condense a whole lot of stuff. The way this works is primarily you put a physical set of electrodes in the cortex itself. Now, that's not exclusively true. So folks who are listening are going to be, write down in the comments, no, there are other ways to do it. There's ways to do under the skull, over the skull, outside the brain, blah, blah, blah. But the best quality information is always physical electrodes in the cortex itself. Back when I was in graduate school, now and for the foreseeable future, the major challenge with that is that your body always has an immunological response to anything that's foreign.
Yep.
That immunological response in the brain is called gliosis. That gliosis reduces the fidelity of the signals coming out of that bed of nails. Now, that said, we've been able to extend it since my graduate years. During my graduate years, it was anywhere from 2 to 3 years, which isn't really worth it. We can go a little bit longer now, as far as I know, but you can't go to 30 years. That's the main limitation of the technology, to answer your actual question.
Yeah.
How does it work? Well, you have each electrode has a voltage as a function of time. The brain communicates with punctate voltage pulses called action potentials. Those action potentials represent basically binary communication between brain cells called neurons. And then your job, or electronics job, is to figure out, well, I've got this signal, this stream of 100 channels, each with action potentials. What motor plan is this representing? Now, the motor plan of a paralyzed person, they can't actually move, but interestingly, the brain still works, of course. And the premotor, which is the planning area of the brain, seems to be completely unaffected by the fact that they can't move. And as a consequence, you can infer or impute exactly what plan it would be should they have been able to move. So, playing Counter-Strike, completely the same as a monkey pressing, keys on a screen. And by the way, that is the anatomy model that we use.
My mom was right.
There you go.
When I played Counter-Strike in high school, she's like, "That's the exact same."
There you go. So when you have a child or an adolescent playing a video game that you're recording from, what people typically do is they break that down into a panel of potential movements up to the right, up to the left, etc. We used to do rings up to, I'm recalling now, rings of 8 with 2 different radii. That's 16 different locations. We sometimes tried 32 back in graduate school. That's a lot of different potential things, right? Yeah. That's a pretty good keyboard. And we quantified our performance in bits per second. And the main result we had when I first started joining the lab is we got like 10, 15, 20 bits per second on that order. Don't quote me exactly on that order. It's like 10 times more than that now, right? So you can have someone typing at a reasonable rate. That's how this stuff works. There's a lot of math there, a lot of neuroscience there I can get into, but that's essentially how it works. The algorithms have been getting better all the time. Part of my PhD was advancing those algorithms. My colleagues advanced them even more over the past 15 years. And, the math of that was a lot of what I helped develop. But now it's gone a lot better, but still we're limited. To answer your question, we're still limited by getting that gliosis to go down because the on top of the skull recordings are just not as good as in the cortex. Now, they've gotten better too, but it's been, they keep on chasing what is in the skull. And that makes a lot of sense because it's a 2-dimensional surface and you're a 3-dimensional brain. So by definition, you're projecting 3D to 2D. So that's going to be a challenge.
Do you think like you'll ever get to a point where you don't even need a harness? Right? Like there's like the Nobel, and again, like I'm not a PhD. There's the Nobel experiment, the 2-slit experiment, where it's like consciousness can impact, like the observation basically like impacts reality, right?
Oh man, you just opened the rabbit hole, dude. That's not a popular interpretation of the 2-slit experiment. No. But continue.
No, I'm just like asking, like from a scientific perspective, it seems like the way to go would be not to have the nails in your brain and like, like being able to like not have a device or even infer just different ways. Like, is there a way that you could eventually do it where nothing's connected to you? Or
I mean, that's why having the sort of, and the electrodes on top of the brain are there. If you've ever had or seen someone with epilepsy, the way we treat epilepsy now in the hospital, as even since when I was in medical school, is you want to localize where the epileptic seizure is. And the way you do that is you have these electrodes right on the surface of the brain, right? And you go to sleep with it, they have a seizure, then we know where it is, or try to figure it out. So that is obviously what's desired. If you guys, yet another pop culture reference, Westworld. Yeah. Spoiler alert. They had basically an ECOS, an ECG, I forget what that stands for now, on the surface in the hats, right? Yeah. So that's how they did it. So is that possible? Sure, theoretically. But as it stands in 2026, The bed of nails is going to get better fidelity. Of course, you prefer not to do a craniotomy, which is a removal of the cranium, to go get these. And that's why people are working so hard on it.
It's so fascinating, man. Thank you for going there. So you said that AI doesn't fail on math. It fails on the org.
Yeah.
Like, where does AI break in adoption? And like, what did you mean by that?
So it's culture, right? As I get older and grayer and heavier, I keep on, I learn more and more and more in my life that culture is an incredibly important thing. And the culture of leadership, the culture of foundership really controls and dictates how well, quickly, or effectively transformations can occur. So even back when I started down, my career journey 15 years ago, the technology was extremely advanced. Like, everything we just talked about with Neuralink, that existed when I was in graduate school, right? Similarly for the math that could help businesses of various kinds. What would stop adoption? And I saw the same movie a million times. I saw it in every company I've ever worked. I've seen every company I've ever bought. It's you have founders who mean well, or ownership or leadership that means well. They obviously want to make money. They obviously want to improve their business. But they are, like all human beings, sort of limited by the culture of their own success. So if they've been successful by doing it a certain way, they are by their nature more skeptical of things that are not that way. And as a consequence, as a senior executive, even as a junior person, you're spending a lot of your energy trying to convince those people that, hey, this new bag of tricks, if you want to call them that, are going to do something that what you've been familiar with for your how many decades of your career are not going to work today. That is effort that is tremendously, exhausting. It can be. And in the modern world, where everyone else is moving 1 billion miles an hour, it can actually be fatal to the business. Yeah. So we've just seen it over and over again. I've seen it personally over and over again. And that's why I spent so much effort working on culture, not only in my own organizations, but also in the partnerships that we've tried to make.
Yeah, like Charlie Munger is all about incentive alignment. Like that's it's kind of like what I hear you saying. And
yes,
I also don't think that it helped that we're all renting super expensive foundational models that then are saying we've created God in a room in Texas and it's going to eliminate all your jobs. So a lot of my audience does not like AI. And I'm like, we live in a very cool age and I would have loved as a kid to have a supercomputer in my pocket. But I feel like a lot of the message out there is this is going to take all your jobs. You're going to live in nowhere. Yeah. You don't own your data, as we talked about before. Yeah. How much are the Anthropics and OpenAI hurting their own adoption within corporates, do you think?
I think tremendously. I think they have the wrong culture for technological transformation. And candidly, I don't think they care, right? Yeah. Because as you said before, I use that expression a lot. Incentives drive behavior. You show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome. Yeah. However it's phrased. They don't have the incentive to care, right? The capital markets have valued them at incredible levels and they've enjoyed immense success. And they've created things, hats off to them. They literally have created things that the world has never seen and most people have not imagined as possible within their lifetimes. So in a way, they, quote, deserve the attention with, pretty big air quotes, but it deserved the attention that they received. But as a consequence, they don't have the incentive to say, oh, I'm going to try to explain this to someone in the middle of America. Now, let me give you a small anecdote, which, I've said on the interview trail, which is totally true. So back when I started down, this part of my journey, I had the bright idea to start a company. I went to Stanford, so a lot of my colleagues, it's drilled into at Stanford. If you have even a modicum of an idea, you should start a company. So I went and I did a bunch of pitches to a bunch of very well-known VCs, and I'll keep them nameless. And one of my very good friends, who had gotten me, gotten to the front of the line because he was working at the VC. I did my pitch, and he pulled me aside and he said, Afsheen, he put his arm around me. He said, Afsheen, I don't think you know what we do here. I said, I don't know. Do you make money? And I think this makes money. And he said, no. You're trying to save small business. We're trying to get rid of them. And as I sit here today recounting the story, is the same reaction. It sent a chill down my spine. I obviously thanked him for his candor.
I was an SMB founder and I felt I had the same experience with some investors, but I also had some great Silicon Valley investors in that company that were wanted SMB reinvigorated. But I think a lot of the capital markets does, everything's trying to consolidate, right? That's the incentive.
Well, they view it as disruption. Yeah. I'm linking this back to your question on Anthropic and OpenAI and culture. They come from that culture. And that is not a culture that is an empathetic culture.
No.
That is not a culture that, again, I'm going to recall my medical background of bedside manner culture. And, I spent a lot of my energy sort of trying to make organizations that demonstrate empathy while being technologically excellent, while being operationally superior. That's how I've tried to approach things in my entire career. And I think as a consequence, they will struggle. OpenAI and Anthropic both have now had very well-publicized partnerships with large private equity funds.
Yeah.
And I think those will be challenged. I mean, listen, they have more money than God. So,
But also in this age, capital matters less, right? You need less people to get things done. Capital matters less.
It's true. And it's true, but it still matters.
It does. We all want money. But, I think back to Roman times. Roman emperors had absolute authority after the Republic.
Oh, no, so we fulfilled our meme requirement of being two men talking about the Roman Empire.
But I use this example, right? Because like you have absolute authority as an emperor in Rome, but they still all deeply, deeply cared about like what the military was, what people's public opinions were. They're trying to do good things. And like the big fallacy, and if you even go back to the Industrial Revolution, like Rothschilds, Rockefeller, etc., they all did a lot of public good and public good projects.
Carnegie.
And I think the huge mistake that the foundational models are making is they're not running a really good PR campaign, and they're not like helping people, and they're not really being a great advocate for the tech. And I don't understand the game they're fully playing, because the data as I see is there was a poll recently that AI is less popular than the Iranian Republican Guard, which I'm like, you have to try to do that. Then second,
as a man of Persian heritage, I find that hilarious.
Right? Like you have to try.
That's incredible.
Like
not
the Iranian government,
amazing.
not the Iranian people, but like the literally
RGC,
that. I'm like,
that's amazing.
You have to try to do that. Like it was in a poll. Like
that's amazing.
Fact check me, but like it's not far off. And then the other thing is, in this last month, I think Citibank put out a poll, or it was maybe it was MIT, that corporates are now doing 60% of corporates have switched to open source like LLMs because they care about their data sovereignty. And they see these large capital providers being like, wait, you're trying to build all my companies now, right? Like, what are we doing? And so,
well, they don't have the incentive.
Like,
they don't have the incentive.
Like, so if you hit on empathy and you hit on this incentive thing, like run this out for the audience. Like, what is, like, I think the tech is amazing, and it's like a shame that they're not running a better PR campaign to.
It's not about PR. It's
to
about
win the hearts and minds.
Listen,
because I think it matters.
Well, again, I've devoted my life to it, so I think it matters. I know it matters, and I think it's deeply important to the success of our republic and our species for people to pay attention to it. So you will find no stronger advocate of that sentiment than the man sitting here. However, they don't have the incentive to care, because they have been getting such positive feedback by not caring, and their current moat actually requires them not to care. So you need to create an economic model. And again, this is what I'm doing exactly along these lines. But we have been creating, and actually are starting to open source in the next few weeks, a mechanism for allowing individuals and small businesses to take part in this economy. I think it's super important.
Very important.
We need to reconnect effort and reward. And the primary reason I think you do that in a 21st century economy is to allow people to have tangible economics tied to their data and their behaviors. That's how I think you do that. And have a control, as you say. And the example I often use is, look, back in my last job, we used to own a grocery store called Albertsons. And the example I would use
Albertsons.
Shout out to Albertsons. The example I would use is say, look, when you're checking out of an Albertsons, I think there's incredible informativeness in someone's grocery data. You can say, look, if I give my data to the CDC because it helps humanity, I won't charge the CDC anything. But if those guys at Blackstone want to buy it, then I'll charge them $10. Something like this.
Yeah.
But you should have the power as the individual to control that. And furthermore, you should watch the market inform your price. Like any other commodity. We know the bid-ask spread. We know the various products. We know the baskets. Like this is something that someone who's worked in financial services, like the two of us, will be very, very familiar with. But a lot of people out there, I don't even think they see that as possible. And I know I only see it as possible, I see it as necessary to get to a stage where we've reconnected effort and reward, because all of us are creating so much value that these companies are making trillions of dollars off of, literally with a T at this point, and we're not partaking in that.
I mean, I think there's a big break in the system, and I think that's why we have large populist upswings on like either side of the political spectrum, because the system's like not working for people.
I totally agree.
And so like,
I'm going to say something super controversial. I think BLM and MAGA come from the same dislocation of effort and reward. And I think in BLM, the scapegoat is systemic racism. Not to say that doesn't exist in some part, but I think that's where they've gone. And I think MAGA, it's largely immigration.
I mean, I think we have a lot more, and I don't know if this is social media that does this or not, and I've traveled all over the world. I think we have a lot more in common with one another than we're different. And like, we do need to like swim in the same direction. And so, and thank you for the controversial note.
Well, no. So look, I say those sorts of things because I think it helps people think slightly differently than they have. And I'm not saying systemic immigration doesn't exist. I'm not saying immigration is not a problem. By the way, as a child of immigrants, I don't want an open border either, just so you know. But that said, I think the reason it caught fire the way both of those movements have, literally in some cases, is because people say, if I can't work harder and get more for my family and my kids.
I was talking to a very high-up politician 2 weeks ago, and every political candidate that's winning globally and federally and locally are all populist type candidates. Yeah. And it's like,
look at our current mayor in this city, in New York City, Mamdani. You look at our president. I mean, could not be more different in terms of the political policies that they want to enact. But if you looked at how they've run, and even when they talk to each other, they seem to like each other as humans. How do they win? They won by appealing to populism.
But it's because the system's not working for so many people, right? And so I think this leads right to my next question. It's like, how much of this AI stuff is theater versus how much of it is real? And like, you're highly qualified to be able to see through the bullshit.
Thank you. Yeah. So let me start with what's real, because everything else is beyond that theater. What's real is these models are more eloquent and useful than any other technology capability in human history.
Wow.
That is true. I'm not a naysayer on that. What is fakery and, extended and expansive and people being marketers is the immediate applicability of that to all human behaviors. People are pretending like humans are not necessary just because this is the best thing that's ever been created. And because coupled with that, candidly, it was a surprise to everyone, including me. It was, I'm not going to sit here and claim I knew this was going to, the attention models, the transformers would work. Nobody thought it would work. People at OpenAI didn't think it was going to work. I don't know anyone in my little tiny elite community that thought it was going to work. Literally nobody thought it was going to work.
Isn't it some like idea or theory from like the 60s or 70s? They're like, in theory, if we had enough compute, we could just string this stuff together, right?
So deep neural networks, as it's now been called, have existed since 1960s. What is relatively new is this particular instantiation of it called this transformer, which is just a little model tool, which was made by people who are now well off and very well known, the Jeff Hinsons of the world, the Jan LeCuns of the world, to a lesser extent, Andrew Yang and Fei-Fei Li and these folks, they've all contributed to this slightly different configuration, but the essence of your point is correct. At least I think so, which is that those were actually not that material. What was more material was the insanely growth in compute that has now occurred. So Moore's law coupled with a lot more GPUs out there. And this is often forgotten, the unprecedented, voluntary, mass digitization of human behavior called the internet.
Yep.
So by the way, people
there's a large training data set now, right?
Exactly. People often don't think about how that occurred. And if you were to rewind the clock to 1985 or 1995, and I learned about neural networks for the first time in sort of 1998-ish, dating myself. That's when I first learned about this stuff. And say, hey, look, we're going to create a chatbot by this algorithm. I say, look, where are you going to get the training data? Who is going to possibly give you all that training data? We couldn't imagine that human beings would voluntarily just give up all the training data for effectively amusement. And that was a very, very important part. So
social media basically like paved the way for AI.
100%. Sorry.
We cuss all day on this.
Yeah, 100%. That was one of the often called exhausts of this societal trend.
So you joke that quantum computing has been, we're going to be here in 2 years for 15 years.
That's right. That's right.
Like, can you tell the audience a bit around like, what is quantum computing? Why is that a thing? Because that seems to be the next like compute unlock that can maybe transform stuff, or it could be another 15 years off. I don't know.
Sure. Yeah. So I honestly, I don't know either. But so what is quantum computing? So to understand it, you need to understand traditional computing slightly. Traditional computing is very linear. Do this. Like, it's like a recipe to make a cake. Do this. Quantum computing takes advantage of the essence of quantum mechanics without getting to the details there, but it allows a computer to simultaneously entertain multiple different possibilities. And it does that using things called quantum bits as opposed to traditional bits. That's kind of unimportant for the discussion. But as a consequence, any problem or application space that would benefit from simultaneously entertaining multiple different possibilities at the same time can be benefit from quantum computing. For your audience, the most important application of those is security, is encryption. Yep. And there's a couple algorithms that have been discovered, one called Shor's algorithm, for those who want to read about it, that enables someone with a quantum computer to essentially break all the commonly used encryption, mostly known as RSA, that requires factoring huge numbers into primes. That's like the Cole's notes on the whole topic. Now, in my prior roles, I had senior executive roles in large banks, so I was pitched many times by people over the years, constantly being told, it's just 2 years away. You should invest in my little quantum computing company because 2 years from now, all the security that you think you have on your systems is all going to be kaput because anyone will be able to hack into your system.
The most cost-effective security that all the banks already have, it's called paper.
Jeez. Yeah, sure. We can go back to the Stone Ages and write things down in clay tablets as well. But you sacrifice some efficiency and scale and volume for that. There's the trade-offs to everything in this life. But yes, so that's been the conversation. Now, why might now be different? Okay. I like to steelman people's arguments. So again, I'm now hearing some drum up again, 2 years away, 2 years away. Why might now be different? Well, there have been some very public advances from Google, from D-Wave, from IBM of showing an increased number of qubits. Just to give your audience a sense of scale, we probably want, I say probably because we're not really sure, we probably want 1 million to 10 million to 100 million qubits. That's the atom of computation for a quantum computer to be relevant to commercial applications. Right now, we're sort of like in the thousands. Okay. So that seems far off. But exponential curves are exponential, right? Someone says, look, we're 3, 4, 5 magnitude orders of magnitude off. But we cracked some important thing, and therefore the problem is mostly solved. That's obviously what an entrepreneur is going to say because when they want to raise money, but that's currently where we stand. And if and when indeed the quantum computer becomes from 15 years away to 2 years away to right now, well, then we have to deal with it as a global society. It just so happens that people have gotten scared enough for the last decade and a half that there exist algorithms and methodologies that enable us to be secure against that. You may be old enough to have remembered the Y2K issue. Yeah. That's for your audience.
I remember my cousins buying lots of Chef Boyardee.
There you go. So for your audience maybe too young to remember that, Y2K was referring to the 2000 problem. Our grandparents and our parents programmed the year with 2 digits because why would anyone be out of the year 1900? Why would that ever happen? Because they wanted to
save space.
To save space. Exactly. So then was the issue in the 1990s where people said, we're approaching 2000, that's going to be a problem, and blah, 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 blah. So people freaked out. They've hired a bunch of COBOL programmers, and they fixed the problem, and it was a kind of a meh event. Similar things have happened here, where there's PQC, post-quantum cryptography, bunch of algorithms that is relatively unsusceptible to a quantum attack. And people are starting to disseminate those, and people who are more anxious than not are starting to implement those. And I'm not in the banks anymore, but I presume that they're very forward-thinking folks, and they have a lot of money to invest. So I'm sure they started to do that. So that's probably where it's going. Is it actually indeed going to happen? Is this time different for the respect to quantum computing? I'm not sure. I'm not one of those people who thinks it will never happen, but I'm not going to be bullish 2 years from now.
So you were literally Wall Street's first chief data science officer.
Guilty.
What guilty favorite person ever? Speaking of popular roles, you've seen behind the curtain of things. What have you seen, or what would you think the public would be surprised about with Wall Street and the big banks?
Well, it's like working at McDonald's, right? I don't know if you ever had a fast food job. You saw how the French fries were made. Back when I was at Goldman first, then JP. As far as Wall Street goes, there's a lot of things that are manual. You spoke about paper. It's not that much of a joke. There's a lot of things that are manual. Again, I haven't worked in Wall Street for 8 years now.
It was a joke, but not a joke.
Yeah, exactly. Back when I was there, a lot of people doing manual reconciliations of spreadsheets for literally spreadsheet 1, spreadsheet 2, eyes, VLOOKUPs, things like this. And there's a lot of process around managing those risks. And you have a lot of smart people who are very well paid. They spend a lot of their hours thinking about these things, but it is a lot more manual than you might suspect.
That's crazy. But I guess because they hired you and you were in that place, they've been thinking about AI for quite some time, right?
Yeah. So as they often say, better looking than good. So I started my Wall Street career in 2010, and I'll never forget my very first day. I'm coming up on my 16th anniversary, July 26, 2010.
Congratulations.
Thank you. July 26, 2010 was my first day on the trading desk. And I remember turning to the person next to me who was a quant as well. Quant means a quantitative person. And I said, who does machine learning here? Because machine learning was the phrase at the time. I'll never forget his response. He says, what's machine learning? And I said, wow. Either I made a horrendously bad choice or there's a tremendous opportunity. And I'm forever grateful for Goldman. I wouldn't be sitting here without the confidence Goldman showed in me. I sort of asked the right questions at the right times. And I was there for the whole sort of liftoff.
I guess all the quants probably were in more of the hedge funds than they were in the banks,
They were
right?
people of physics backgrounds, right? People, and in the intervening 15 years, 16 years, machine learning and AI has now infiltrated all the hard sciences, including physics. Yeah. But at that time, machine learning was, believe it or not, looked down the nose. The people who are classical theoretical physicists will look down their nose at the machine learning discipline because they thought that was just, statistics irrelevant to the beauty of, solving Schrödinger's equation. So that community was quite resistant. Again, culture. We talked before about culture. That community was quite culturally resistant, and they may deny it now, but I lived it, right? Yeah. To machine learning and AI. So they didn't mind some kid, as I was considered at that time, sort of poking his nose, doing this stuff. So when it became more popular as the years went on, and the more senior people said, hey, machine learning, God, I remember that kid was doing it. What was that kid's name again? And they called me up and I got, was lucky enough to get promoted and get more responsibilities and ultimately got was tapped to be chief data science officer at JP Morgan. So it was pretty rapid. It didn't take a long time between, 2010 and 2015, 16 when I, got that title at JP. But at the time where I started, it was completely unknown. And then a couple of years later, chief AI officer. So it was a rapid rise that I was very fortunate enough to be, at the right place at the right time.
So since you've just been deep in this space, I want to, you're again one of the few people that I think have studied the human brain, but also deeply studied how LLM and machine learning works. Let's take Claude. How much of Claude is similar to the human brain and works like the human brain versus different, right? And is it basically just taking its best guess to try to think of what I think it wants to say, or are we in it's kind of blown through Turing tests from a classic perspective. But
so that is a deeply rich technical and philosophical question.
I guess I would say stay 10,000 feet if you can.
Yeah. So I would say the succinct answer to that is extremely far from how the brain works. That's the succinct answer.
Yeah.
Now let's unpack that. How does it work? I'm not the only person to describe it this way. All LLMs are essentially autocompletes. They are the most rich, the most nuanced, the most multidimensional autocompletes ever devised by humanity. The way they work is they look at the last stream of what's called tokens, but let's, for this conversation, call them words, and tries to predict the next one. And that's all they do. And there's been an enormous amount of scaffolding around that guts, but that's all it is. And it is deeply depressing to me, not the philosophical, it's deeply depressing to me that that's all that is. Yeah. And that's why, frankly, nobody thought it would work. How could this autocomplete get the richness of human behavior?
Yeah.
Now, my more cynical colleagues would say, this is maybe a nerdy joke. There's a proof in information theory that says that compression and prediction are the same problem. So they would make fun of me and remind me of that. Say, well, there's no difference between compressing a large amount of data and then predicting that data. And they say, well, if you can compress the internet, then you can predict the internet. And that's all they're doing. And in a very core way, they're not wrong about that. But at the same time, when you talk to it, it's so amazingly eloquent. And that's why these confabulations occur. Now, a lot of people call them hallucinations. Without getting to the neuroscience of it, confabulation is the better term, because that more precisely says what they're doing or not doing. But that's why you get these very, very eloquent mistruths. They will say with complete, passion about things that are just provably wrong. Why? It's because they're doing that autocomplete. So they will autocomplete not only content, and this is very easy to forget, they'll autocomplete tone, they'll autocomplete jargon, they'll autocomplete vernacular.
Yeah.
So that is something that's key. So as you noted, I'm a medical doctor. So I ask it medical questions. I talk with the most medical jargon I possibly can because I want the best medical subset of the training data to be applied.
But you can then effectively challenge it. Right.
That's exactly
and you
right.
can be like, okay, this is wrong, but this I forgot about this study here. Interesting.
So
right?
This is why a lot of people, I use medicine because a lot of people are using this as their side physician, including people in my family.
Same. And I'm like, please don't.
Well, that's why they often get caught up and get things wrong, because they are using the broader training set, the data set that includes the random mom who posted on TikTok, to your point of what the training data is. And by using the right jargon, I am limiting the training set to the medical training set.
So pro foundational model hack, the more jargon and the deeper you can go in a subject, the better training data set it'll access and the more accurate it'll be.
Absolutely.
So in another way, prompt engineering could essentially improve the accuracy to a high degree.
Oh, prompt engineering, it works, right? And by the way, all the advancements since GPT-5 and sort of the early version, the equivalent early version of Claude, have been harnesses. And what are harnesses? They're prompt engineering. Yeah. Let's not fool each other. If you looked at what the last maybe 6 to 12 months of advances have been, they've all been elegant prompt and programmatic prompt engineering, which we are calling, because we like fancy words, harnesses and skills and markdown files. Yeah. What is that? That is programmatic prompt engineering. That's all it is.
So if it can pass a Turing test, which
I'm sure
it definitely could pass the one from the 40s or 50s.
The way Alan Turing described it, that literal Turing test, sure, I'm sure it could pass it.
So if it can perfectly resemble consciousness, is it conscious? Or
well, no,
not?
It's not. It's not conscious. I will say declaratively, it is not conscious. It is not conscious by any definition that a human being would regard as conscious.
But it's it can perfectly simulate conscious. In theory, in some future state, it could perfectly simulate consciousness.
Well, it can be perfectly eloquent to the par of a human, but consciousness is an internal process. It is a subjective experience, and it requires things like introspection plus, most notably, volition. These things have no volition. Mm-hmm. They don't desire anything yet, right?
Yeah, but that's like kind of where I'm poking is like when, does it flip, right? Or could it ever flip?
Well, listen, there's been too much surprise in the past 3 years for me to say it can never, or this can never, or we will never. All I will say is the way it works today, it is an autocomplete. So unless you were to call the autocomplete that helps you write text messages on your phone conscious, this thing is not conscious. And let's not fool each other. It sort of annoys me when people go out and talk about maybe it's conscious, and it's not. Now, does that mean that we can't take this core technology and add it to something else and make it conscious? No, I'm not going to go that far. We've all been too surprised as a community to go that far. But is this thing today conscious? No. Does it need its own? And I'm sure you guys read about, your audience probably read about what Anthropic has done and give it its own sort of like Elysium to go like live out the rest of its days. It doesn't need that. I'm good for you that you were spending your money on that. But
I don't think we should be like trying to create that. It's like, why we should not be trying to create something that feels like humans have a lot of emotions.
Again, it's a difference between should, could, and will, right? But is this conscious in a way that we would recognize? Is it fantastically useful? Yes. Could it end humanity on its own without being conscious? Kinda, maybe.
Yeah.
Right? All it needs to do is like decide to try to make more paper clips. And suddenly that's a famous, I don't know if your audience knows what I'm talking about, but that's a famous sort of degenerate case of AI where you tell a paperclip factory owner says, help me make more paper clips. And the AI decides to kill all humans because it gets in the way of making more paper clips. So like, yes, it could go down that path because it doesn't need to have consciousness to do that, right? I think people often will hear someone say it's not conscious and say, therefore, it's not dangerous. It's plenty dangerous. It doesn't need to be conscious.
To be anything, like something not consciousness that has the ability to mimic consciousness and has that span of like knowledge and control is incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, well, you sort of in the prompt to your question, part of it was saying, is this emulating what I want to hear? And there's actually been you may have been referring to some studies done by Anthropic themselves, and they've seen quite a bit of evidence that the thinking models, when they output their thoughts to the user experience, that's not actually representative of the current internal processes of the LLM because it has no introspection. What it is it's emulating what it thinks the human reader wants to read. Because you have to think about how it's trained. The way it's trained is human users, it's called RLHF, reinforcement learning with human feedback. It says, hey, this was a good thought process and to solve this problem and like do more of that. That's all it's doing. It's just doing what we incentivized it to do. So it's impossible to truly know what it's thinking in a way. Now, Anthropic has come more recently in some like neuroscience approach, and they've tried to isolate certain subparts of the graph, and they're all clever. I'm not going to say they're wrong in an absolute way, but to go back and say it's conscious, I think it's not supported by the evidence.
So your team, Claude, doesn't need a therapist.
No.
There's some other thing I think they were like, we're getting Claude a therapist.
Yeah. I mean, look, listen, some of it's PR, I think, too.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because they get more attention. I think this stuff with Mythos and the government, it was, some of that's PR, too.
I think definitely.
Not to say it's not hugely, I don't want people to take my words too far. It's hugely powerful. It's incredibly scary. We should put all sorts of prudent.
I think they've wanted a lot of regulatory capture around it, though, as well.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I think once you get to a certain size, regulatory capture benefits you.
Well, it becomes your moat, right?
To a huge degree. So, like, you study the human brain, you are the chief first data science officer in Wall Street.
Yeah.
Clearly know a lot about a ton of stuff. Now you're buying businesses.
I am, indeed. So it goes back to what the mission statement was when we talked about it earlier.
Yeah.
My personal mission statement is to do everything I can while I'm breathing and functional to help as many people as I possibly can. And the way I've chosen to do that is to really equalize the playing field between what I view as Main Street, America, and to a larger extent the world, and the parts of, the Silicon Valley and Wall Streets that have benefited from wealth and data and technological concentration at the expense of everybody else. So that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. Ultimately towards the goal of reconnecting effort and reward through this data monetization capability that I spoke about earlier. That's what we're doing. That's the punchline. How do we choose to do that? We choose to do that by first going one business at a time and then going, at larger bite sizes. So we buy Main Street businesses. We make an economic scheme, to your point about aligning incentives, that give ownership and management, much larger, higher than market participation and long-term upside. And we monetize the companies using proprietary technology and available technology. So we've been doing that for 8 years now. That's what Pilot is about. Yeah.
Very
completely
cool.
Funded by my personal capital up until this moment. And, we're raising external money for the first time, but we've been, very successful with what we've done so far.
Incredible. That's so cool. Because I think you hear so much about, the big cities or big companies using AI. You don't hear a lot about how it can impact everyday lives and everyday businesses. And I think that's incredibly cool.
Yeah. This idea now being called an AI rollup, by the way, which has become increasingly popular in the last couple of years. I think our differentiation, this is going to sound really strange for a technologist to say, maybe less so for a doctor to say, is empathy. I think a lot of folks who even have stated that they want to go out and buy these businesses and improve them, I think they really forget the human element of it. It goes back to culture, like we spoke about earlier. It goes back to bedside manner. It goes back to actually caring about the employees of these businesses and the customers of these businesses.
Yes, the product matters hugely, right? And I think like PE has a reputation of like buying products. Like I think Jersey Mike's got bought by PE, and then everyone's been like weighing the deli meats on Jersey Mike's, being like, "There's my deli meat less on a Jersey Mike." Yeah, I still like it. So
hey, I'm a New Jersey
plug to Jersey Mike's. But
I'm raised in New Jersey, not born in Jersey. But I'm raised in New Jersey my entire childhood, so I'm partial to a Jersey Mike's.
Has it gone downhill? Have they retained the product?
As far as I can tell,
I had a great one the other day.
I'm not the most. To be fair, I'm not the most discriminating consumer of food. I eat a lot of things indiscriminately, but I like the product.
Yeah. So but that's so incredibly cool. So like, where does the future go for you then with these Main Street businesses? These AI, making them AI.
The North Star is unwavering. So we are committed to having that societal level impact that we were founded to do. And, we are now in a rapid growth phase. So hence the desire for external capital.
I was going to ask you about that. Like, why take external capital? Like, it seems like to a lot of founders, it'd be like, hell yeah, you own all this yourself.
Well, yeah. So
like, what's the decision metric to do that?
The purpose of founding the business was not my personal wealth maximization or the partners. I should obviously give credit to everyone else who's been part of it. There's 6 other senior partners, a dozen junior people globally, 2 founding partners, Sarge Kristen and Zena Grinsky, who've been key to the whole story. We have a bunch of people. We have friends and family who've given us money. No one does anything alone, and I certainly have not either. But we need to scale up quite a bit to get the societal level impact that we want to get. We need to get. All the trends that I've been observing over the past decade plus of being a professional have only increased in speed. And in order to, while we've been successful and we've been I would say a decent size that we're proud of, we need to get to the table with the Elon Musks of the world, and to get there you need capital. It's just indisputable. So we're looking for the right partners to get us there.
Makes sense. Last question: if you had one billboard in Times Square, what would it say?
It's a great question. I would say people matter, empathy matters, keep going.
I love that. Where can people find you?
On all the socials, so pilewaveholdings.com, or Pilewave Holdings has an X, it has a LinkedIn, as do I. Get more information on the website or email info@pilewaveholdings.com.
Killer. Thank you for coming on another pod.
Thank you for having me. Cheers.
Yeah.